top of page 3, Rome. Now you see Rome number 6, so you think in your mind, well, what has been number 1, 2, 3, 4? Let's go back and look at that then, because that's going to take us over to Daniel's book, which was the book a long time ago. We haven't been in Daniel in a while, but that a long time ago had a lot to do with our studies here in the period between the Testaments. Skipping number 1, that's just kind of summing everything up. Under C on page 1, Roman numeral 2, large letter C, Daniel's 4 world Gentile kingdoms. Then you see number 2, Babylon, and you turn the page, Medo-Persia, Greece, fourfold kingdom. So we've got Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. And then the Maccabees, of course, are kind of a little interlude here. At the end of Greek domination, before Rome comes on the scene, she has a period of religious political independence for approximately a century of time. And then finally, Rome comes on the scene. Keep your chart out there. We'll be back to that, or your outline, in just a moment, and let's go to Daniel's prophecy, chapters 2 and 7, where we have the double description, one from the point of view of a heathen monarch and one from the Lord's prophet, Daniel in Babylon, of this fourfold world domination of Gentile powers. And basically they're named here if you put all the passages in chapters 2, 7, and 8. Chapters 2, 7, and 8 together, you'll end up with them, and I will show you that as we go along. With the exception of the fourth and final one, and how we come to that conclusion we'll state in a moment. Second chapter, 31st verse, after Nebuchadnezzar's had this dream, thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image, generally referred to as the colossal image of Daniel's prophecy. And then it is described in verses 32 and 33. The image's head was of fine gold, and his breast and his arms of silver, and his belly and his thighs of brass, and his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. I had to draw a science fair project of what this colossal image was supposed to look like. Of course, it's anyone's guess, but you have a lot of description here. Just draw a picture of a head and the torso region, and get some legs and feet and add some toes on, and then color it different colors, and you'll end up with the gold, silver, and the brass or the bronze, and the iron and the clay. And so he goes on down in the end of verse 38. You've got the gold, silver, bronze, and iron iron mixed with clay. The end of verse 38, thou art this head of gold. So that pretty much identifies this first world power from a Gentile point of view, and that's stated on your outline as Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar being the representative of Babylon. Then over in chapter 7, verses 4 through 7, you have this description again, now through the eyes of the Lord's prophet Daniel, and therefore God depicts these heathen kingdoms and their respective monarchs just as they are, and that would be as ravenous beasts seeking to devour his little lamb of Israel. And so you've got one in verse 4, the lion, in verse 5, the second one, the bear, the third one in verse 6, the leopard, and then the strange one in verse 4. So you say, well, that only still names one kingdom for us thus far. Well, if you go over to the next chapter in the 20th verse, we've gone into the ram and the he-goat. Of course, a lot of you are fairly familiar with this now, so it's just kind of rehearsing this to bring us up to date with this fourth kingdom. You're familiar with it, at least on the surface, because we've gone over this before. The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. So that's fairly easy to interpret then, that the breast and the arms of silver would be the Medo-Persian Empire. Next verse, in the rough goat, we're down to the belly and the thighs of bronze from chapter 2, is the king of Grecia, or Greece. And the great horn that is between his eyes is Alexander the Great. So that identifies. One thing interesting about Daniel's prophecy is that it identifies 3 of the 4 precious metals found in the colossal image and of chapter 2 of Nebuchadnezzar, and 3 of the four ravenous beasts as depicted from Daniel's point of view and from God's point of view and from Israel's point of view in the 7th chapter. However, that still leaves us with this 7th verse in chapter 7. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. In KJV lingo, it's just known as the dreadful, terrible, strong, exceedingly beast. And it had great iron teeth. Now see, the iron connects it with the iron feet and the toes of iron and mixed with clay of chapter 2. We have the iron here. It devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it. We're back to feet there. That was the part of the image that was being considered in chapter 2. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. Well, in what way was it diverse? Well, in various ways, and we're not going to try to catalog those now, but you'll see those over the next few months as we look at Rome. Rome's empire, the extent of Rome's empire was just tremendous compared to the other kingdoms. The way Rome went about ruling her empire was quite a bit different than the other kingdoms. Rome starts more or less from a barbarous point of view, but with the assimilation of Greek culture and conquering the Greeks, the kingdom just prior to them, then they pick up a lot of good humanitarian aspects, which are good. Then we end up with Rome as we know it today, which is United States of America. I'm not saying that United States is Rome fulfilled in prophecy, but I mean the origin of our system of law and court and justice and so many things can be derived from Rome. So Daniel doesn't mention the name. How do we know that it's Rome? Well, go to school beyond the, 10th grade or something, and you'll find out, or somewhere along the line, you'll find out, if you do any studies there, maybe you have to get up into college, that the next world empire after Greece was Rome. So it's just a matter of deduction, in other words. By deduction, we know that after Greece, or we would know technically after the Hasmonean dynasty, or the Maccabees, after them would come Rome on the scene. So it's depicted there in Daniel 2 and over in Daniel chapter 7 here as well. So the Romans are the ones who gained control of Palestine just prior to the beginning of the New Testament. Not trying to be real technical, we could say 63 years, since we're talking about 63 BC, when Pompey invades Palestine. So just prior to the setting of the New Testament era, Rome comes on the scene not only as a world power, but as a power in the Levant, or a power in Palestine. So all of the other study, you see, going way back to Babylon, Babylon's prior to the period between the Testaments, you see. Medo-Persia really starts intertestamental period history, and really Greece, because we don't have much of Medo-Persia after 400 BC. But we study that to make all the connections here. The reason why we're studying the intertestamental period is to make the connection between the Old and New Testaments. And so obviously, as we are drawing closer in our studies and in time to the New Testament, then the empire and the events under consideration are more important. That means Rome is more important just for our point of view and for our purpose of study right now than any of the other kingdoms at which we've earlier looked. So I think you'll find it interesting to learn some things about Rome. I find it interesting that Jesus didn't come during the Greek era and try to be a messianic counterpart to this fabulous man Alexander. Jesus was a young man as well. And he didn't come during the Greek era. He didn't come during the Hasmonean era or the Maccabean era, where here you would think, well, we've got political independence. A lot of people have never thought of this. We've got political independence in Palestine, religious as well during this time. What an ideal situation into which the Messiah could be born and could be brought. Well, I guess it'd have to be competing with some of the sons of Mattathias. So, no, God just let history run its course, and history provided great Jewish leaders in the period between the Testaments, most notable of those, of course, being those from the Maccabean line, but none qualified as the Messiah. None qualified as the Messiah. God's waiting until Rome comes on the scene, and you have to go back to the first 3 tapes in this series on why it seems like God counted, and we retrospectively also count Rome as being the fulfillment of the fullness of time. Brought in a period of peace and advancement that the world had not seen prior to that time. Not that Israel is really a peaceful nation, but Rome extends her peace, beginning with the reign of Augustus Caesar, who took that title in 27 B.C. and rules up until Tiberius in A.D. 14, and lasts for a period of a couple of hundred years, known as the Pax Romana. And we'll get to that later on whenever we get to Augustus Caesar. Okay, let's go to our chart before we go back to our outline, before we get into the message then. All you need to be concerned about, I say all, it's a lot, but all for a while now is, if you look on your chart there at 63 BC in bold writing, Roman period. From there all the way down to the last date on our chart, which is 4 BC. So we're just talking about a period of 60 years here. But notice the amount of information that is crammed into this period. Along the line of Jewish leaders, let's begin there. We have Hyrcanus II, and it mentions him as high priest. We're just going over this so I know that at least you've seen it once if you haven't looked at this earlier. High priest and ethnarch of the Jews. So what is an ethnarch? We'll have to get into those technical terms as they were used, and sometimes they were used not so technically though. And down the gray line, Antipater, Antigonus, king and high priest. And then we have a figure that we probably all are familiar with, Herod the Great, king of Judea. He's the Herod of Matthew 2, the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem. And underneath the name of Herod, you've got Ananel, Aristobulus III, Jesus, Simon, and so forth, high priests. All of that is a little questionable. It's really difficult to pinpoint that precisely. We've already seen that earlier before we got to the Seleucid control of Palestine, that it was a little difficult to know exactly who was high priest at what time. Okay, dropping underneath that, we see the most important of the Cleopatras. We've introduced Cleopatras way earlier whenever she was married to the right person in Daniel 11, but Cleopatra, the seventh Philopater, is the Cleopatra of Liz Taylor and Richard Burton fame, and the Cleopatra of Sunday school and of grade school that most of us are familiar with, Cleopatra the seventh. So we've gone through, well, obviously 6 of them to get to her. And we've got other Ptolemies all the way down to Ptolemy the 14th, and then notice there, 30 BC, Egypt becomes property of the Roman emperor under a prefect. Now there's another one of those technical titles. Hyrcanus II was an ethnarch of the Jews. Now Egypt becomes a Roman province under a prefect, and we'll discuss all those titles later. Because when you get over into the book of Acts, then we have to, and in the Gospels as well, discuss who actually was a king in the technical sense. Herod is called a king here, Herod the Great, king of Judea. Well, so is Herod Philip. Was Herod Philip really a king in the technical sense? What's an ethnarch? What's a procurator? What's a prefect? Was Pontius Pilate a procurator or a prefect? Or does it make any difference? Or does it depend on what time we're talking about? Was Pontius Pilate a prefect or a procurator? So we'll be to that because some archaeological discoveries have been made in the last 25 years, and I saw one of them where we know for certain of the ruling of Pontius Pilate in Caesarea during the days of Jesus. So just more of archaeology that confirms what we already believe to be true in the New Testament. And then under that you have Syria, 64 BC. Syria made a Roman province. And then we have these various legates. I don't think we're given the technical title here on the chart, but Scaurus all the way down to Mark Antony. Right under the phrase Syria made a Roman province were something like legates who controlled Syria, and Syria controlled Judea. So Judea was a province under Syria, which was the more important of the two. This is just kind of telling you what we're going to be into in the future. You don't have to remember all of this. Then extending beyond Mark Antony, where he's on the line of the Syrian legates, we have Hillel and Shammai. Ever heard of those two names before? Hillel and Shammai? Well, that question of divorce and remarriage in the Gospels concerns these two men right here in Matthew 19. That the Pharisees came before Jesus and said, "Is it lawful to put away your wife for every cause?" And the thought or the scene behind their question would be the pupils or the schools under Hillel and Shammai. And so you have to know what these two men believe, famous Jewish rabbis, what these men believe to really understand the whole question of divorce and remarriage there. We're into this historical context business again. You can't just run through the Bible. You have to know it and understand it and comprehend it in its cultural and historical context. Then we see Philo or Philo, however you want to pronounce his name. He was the famous Jewish philosopher of Alexandria. And of course, we have some of his writings as well. And then we drop all the way down to the bottom, and then that brings us into what we're going to be looking at tonight. That drops us down into Roman emperors. Of course, we really don't have Roman emperors to begin with because Rome's controlled by the Senate, but the Senate's passing off the scene in the beginning of the 1st century B.C. We're talking about 90 B.C. We have many problems in Rome during this period. The Roman Republic has really run its course. And we come into what's the so-called first and second triumvirate, where we've got Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, then Mark Antony, misspelled as Anthony there, but Antony, misspelled twice it looks like, Octavian, who was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar and who became Augustus Caesar, took the title in 27 B.C., though he begins ruling in 30 B.C., and Lepidus. And you see Julius Caesar in between. And you've got various dates scattered vertically throughout that. In 63 B.C., Pompey invades Palestine. In 48 B.C., we have the complete mastery of Julius Caesar over the Roman Senate because of the death of Pompey. Then, of course, you got the so-called Ides of March, March 15th, 44 B.C., the date for the assassination of Julius Caesar. Second triumvirate of Antony, Octavian, Lepidus, the Battle of Actium off the coast of Greece, where Octavian Augustus defeats Mark Antony and he and Cleopatra flee back to Egypt and commit suicide. And then that brings us into Octavian Augustus from 30 B.C. to A.D. 14, which makes him the Roman emperor at the time of the birth of Christ. Okay, now, if you're worried, don't be worried, or frightened, don't be frightened. We'll be into this all in the future. But remember that Roman and Greek classical civilization was kind of my hobby in college. I almost majored in it, and then I got out of that. So we'll try to spare you of the details and just give you a simplified view of that. Okay, on page 3, here's what we're going to be looking at then. And I think we'll probably do A tonight. Early history. Origin on the Tiber River, control of the Italian peninsula, and the Punic Wars. So you know it's outlined for you. We're going to be on the outline, basically, I think, hopefully, now that I've said that, and I hope we'll be on it. But I don't think we'll get down to Caesar and Pompey and all of this. We'll have to, what do we have here? The years of the first and second triumvirate, first triumvirate, confusing political affairs in Palestine. They'll get us back to Aristobulus and Hyrcanus II. The members of the triumvirate, the victories of Caesar, assassination of Caesar, second triumvirate, Roman emperors of the first Christian century, important rulers in Palestine, and we'll give others besides those that are mentioned, those 9, Herod the Great, Archelaus, Herod Philip, Herod Antipas, Pontius Pilate, Agrippas 1 and 2, Antonius Felix, and Porcius Festus. But those are the important ones because those are the ones with whom you're familiar from the pages of the New Testament. So it's interesting to know something about them because all of them are called Herod. Herod the Great, Herod Philip, Herod Antipas. There's another Herod Philip. They're all called Herod, and so it's difficult to determine which Herod we're talking about, and several of them go by the name Philip. And so we're talking about evidently different Philips, and one was a private citizen and one was a tetrarch. So we'll make those distinctions whenever we get there. Tonight, the dawn of Rome, the origin of Rome. Now, what we know about Rome, which is only a little bit, is shrouded in secrecy because it's based on legend. So, if you'll pardon me, I'll just give you the stereotypes because you probably aren't interested in much more than that. Just the stereotypes of the shrouded past secret history of the founding of the Republic of Rome. Now, comparatively speaking, the Roman Empire is really the new kid on the block. We think of Rome as this ancient, great power, ancient, powerful civilization. But comparatively speaking, if we're going to date it according to legend, it's 753 BC. 753 BC is really not that long ago, and it's really not that early. Just think of the ancient civilization of the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Sumerians and the Assyrians and even the Medes and the Persians and so forth. And even the Greeks go back quite a bit. So Rome, whole classes in college are just taught on just the subject of Rome because there's something romantic about the study of Rome and Roman culture. And I guess that's why I'm saying what I'm saying. Rome is just a fabulous city, a fabulous empire, a fabulous topic to study, and that's why a lot of people can really get wrapped up in studies of Rome. But sometimes what happens at the very beginning is people fail to realize how recent the Roman Empire really is. It does not have the great early years to call upon like the Egyptian Empire. We're talking about 3000 BC there. Or the Sumerian, Summerian, the Sumerian Empire over in the Mesopotamian region, which came before the Babylonian Empire and before the Assyrian Empire, that goes back to the early dates of the founding of Egypt as well, 4,000 BC. 4,000 BC, Rome, 753 BC. It's a new kid on the block. So that has to be taken into consideration first of all. Now Rome took its name from its capital city, the so-called City of Seven Hills, founded on the Tiber River, according to legend by Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf, raised by a shepherd, and they finally, the master of the two, built the fabulous city on seven hills in 753 BC. If you'll pardon the stereotypes, but those are the stereotypes, and I'm no scholar in Roman history. I'm sure there's a lot more that could be said, but I am positive of this: not a lot can be proven about the early history of Rome. It's just shrouded in mystery and secrecy. If you'll turn over to the book of Revelation, the 17th chapter, we do have an interesting verse here, Revelation 17:9. That's interesting, whether we are Catholic or not Catholic. It's interesting nonetheless.
Amen.
The verse that we have in Revelation 17 and verse 9. Assuming that we all agree, and nobody who knows anything would disagree, that Rome is the city founded on seven hills. Here is the mind which hath wisdom. The seven heads are seven mountains on which the woman sitteth. Now the woman, in verse 5, is called Mystery, Babylon the Great. Notice what it's called there, mystery. There's always something mysterious and secret about Rome. Say, well, you're assuming a lot because we haven't proven the point we're talking about Rome here. Well, just hold on a minute. Upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Not the best description. No woman would want to be called this, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And this woman was drunken with the blood of the saints. Well, that's generally interpreted to mean, and I don't really see any reason why we shouldn't follow it, that she's responsible for the martyrs of saints, Christians, probably since we're talking about the book of Revelation in AD years, she's responsible for the martyr of Christians. And goes on to say, with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So we're not talking about Isaiah or Zechariah, unless we're talking about Isaiah the 22nd or something, and he was a Christian. When I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. The angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman, and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns. Now you have to return to chapter 13, which we're not going to do, to find out about that beast. The beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall be. Kind of like what's said of Christ in chapter 1, the one who was, and is to come. This one was the one who was, and then is not, but then shall ascend. out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. He says something similar in the conclusion of chapter 13. He said, here is a number, and if you're wise, you'll know it, 666. That's the end of chapter 16, verse 18. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast. Chapter 13 and verse 18. For it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. We don't use 60 anymore, so 666. But my point is, notice the first phrase there in verse 18. Here is wisdom. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number. Okay, and then chapter 17 and verse 9. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. Then he goes into the prophecy of the kings and how many have arisen and fallen, how many are presently ruling, and how many are yet to come. So this woman who sits on the 7 mountains, who is a mystery and whose name is Babylon the Great, is an interesting figure. It's a little enigmatic there, but if you'll look over in the last chapter of 1 Peter and the 13th verse, Peter has an enigmatic, and perhaps it should be taken as a cryptic statement here, which would be a cryptic designation of something that's not seen on the surface. 1 Peter 5 and verse 13. Peter is writing from this place because he's giving greetings. The church that is at Babylon, elected together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus, my son. Mark. That's probably the John Mark that wrote the Gospel of Mark, not the Gospel of John. That's John, son of Zebedee. But John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, and we know that just from reading Mark's Gospel, and you compare it with the last 2 chapters of the book of Romans, we know that Mark is writing his Gospel for a Roman audience. That is a Christian audience, but a Christian Roman audience. There's no doubt about that. And so, in other words, where is Mark? Where is Mark's home base of sense? In Rome. And so what's Peter saying here? I mean, Babylon, as we know, Old Testament, biblical Babylon's way thousands of miles away, over at the Tigris and Euphrates River. So what's Peter saying here? But the church that is at Rome, elected together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus, my son. Now, we'll get into that more later on, like in New Testament introduction. But if that hypothesis is true, and a lot of things would point toward that, then this designation as Babylon is just meant to be enigmatic, but meant to be cryptic, but meant to be understandable to the people to whom Peter is writing, and during which time Peter is writing, that Babylon must have already taken on the significance, although 1 Peter is written earlier than Revelation chapter 17, the significance of Babylon the Great, the mystery city of Revelation chapter 17. So why did we get into all of this? Simply because of Revelation 17:9. 7 mountains, 7 mountains, 7 mountains. That's the only reason we turn over here. 7 mountains. Rome is the city founded on 7 mountains. And it seems like the New Testament bears that out and has more things to say about that. In Old Testament history, for the foundation of Rome, were around the time of Jeroboam II and King Uzziah. To put you back in Old Testament history, accepting the stereotyped date of 753 for the foundation of Rome. We're back during the time of Jeroboam II and King Uzziah. Now, Jeroboam II was, well, Israel. This is the northern kingdom. Uzziah was a southern king, a Judean king. Israel is experiencing a revival of Solomonic, of Davidic and Solomonic days, whenever the extent of the empire reaches further than it ever has, with the exception of the Davidic and Solomonic reigns earlier. So it's kind of thought of as the golden era, or a golden revival of a golden era that had existed in Israel during the days of Kings David and Solomon. And now Jeroboam II, Jeroboam I, remember, was one of the kings right after Solomon's death. But Jeroboam II, quite some time later, is extending the boundaries of Israel quite far to the north, all the way up to Euphrates again, which is similar to what had been done during the times of David and Solomon. The prophets Amos and Hosea are on the scene prophesying whenever this little insignificant city of Rome is founded. Amos and Hosea were just a little prior to the time of Isaiah. 753 BC, notice we're a little prior to the fall of Israel to Assyria in 722. We're just a couple of decades prior to the fall of Israel. And so Rome rises and Israel falls. Now let's go up front to take a look at a map. Oh, we got to get enough of it on there. I suppose that's enough. This is a map that dates from the first couple of centuries AD. The different colors and the different lines. There's a dotted line over here that you really can't see. Take into consideration a period of a couple of hundred years. Now, most of the maps this is a picture of the entire Mediterranean Sea here, with the exception of Gibraltar, or the Straits of Gibraltar over here. But most of the maps that I've ever put up have been, if they've had Rome at all, they've been something like this, if you can see where the pointer is. In other words, just this side. So that this, proportionally, is extremely small compared to what you earlier have seen up here. You have to acclimate yourself, because instead, here's, in other words, Asia. And sometimes I've had a map where Asia would take up the whole thing here. So you have to get used to where we are. We're way down here, and here's Israel, and here's Rome. 800 miles or something away, I would say. Now, Italy, everyone knows of Italy as the boot, the country that's shaped like a boot. You learned that way back in grade school as well. Italy was first settled on its western shores here. Now, Italy, everyone knows of Italy as the boot, the country that's shaped like a boot. You learned that way back in grade school as well. Italy was first settled on its western shores here by people that had come from this region up in what is now the USSR. It was first settled by people on its western shore, maybe somewhere around 1000 BC. So we're talking about just tribes of people who are migrating for various reasons, but reasons that generally relate to food and to livestock and to the climate and so forth. So they've migrated here, and of course we're not talking about the foundation of Rome, the city itself. Remember, Rome is the city, it's the capital, and then Rome is the empire as well. It gains its name from the capital. But the people have settled here, especially up in this northwestern corner, a group of people known as the Etruscans. E-T-R-U-S-C-A-N-S. The Etruscans. Just like it sounds. T-R-U-S-C-A-N-S. Rome is founded somewhere around 753, but in the founding of Rome, we're not talking about the palatial Rome of Augustus Caesar. We're talking about a muddy little village, is all we're talking about, that exists that way for quite some time. How cities actually become great cities, a whole lot of factors contribute to that, which is really not our point of study now. But of course you're familiar with the fact that, well, it's even true today, that your great cities are located on water. And if you're not located right on the sea, which of course Rome is not, it's like 7 miles inland, you're located on a river that is navigable from the sea up unto the city. So Rome is just a little village at this time. Over the next couple of hundred years, it strengthens, it begins to grow, and the people begin to conquer the other people around them, particularly the Etruscans up here in the northwest corner of Italy. So that by the year 265 BC, Rome as a city has almost total control of the Italian peninsula, with a few exceptions way down here to the extreme southeast, which is the spike here on the boot, down in this general area, with a few exceptions here. Now this happens to be not only a map for geographical purposes, but for topographical purposes as well. And these various, what look like shadows or something, of course, are mountain ranges here. You can see mountains run down the center of Italy. Obviously, when you have a river coming in, you're going to have plain on both sides of it. By the way, this is the Alps. Some of you probably don't even know exactly where the Alps are. You've got Alps over here, and Switzerland, of course, is right here today. But here are the Alps that will become important in the Punic Wars here in a moment. So by 265, Rome has extended control over the Etruscans and control all along the western shore, which has always been and really still is the most important part of Italy today, is the western shore, not the eastern shore. 265 is an important date for an approximation for Rome gaining rather complete control of the Italian peninsula after defeating the Etruscans to the northwest. Now, the next great thing to consider are the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars bring Rome to world power. All she has now, 265 BC, is control of this geography, the Italian peninsula. The Punic Wars changed Rome's history, and because Rome's history has changed, so has been the world's. After defeating the various bands, the Etruscans being among them, of Italy, her next major foe was the great rival maritime power of Carthage. Now, as I said earlier, most of our maps so far have cut off somewhere like this. So I've never been able to show you Carthage. But here's Carthage, the famous North African city that was a colony of Phoenicia, believe it or not. The Carthaginians are Phoenicians, in other words. And you know of Phoenicia, we're way over here. Phoenicia ran along the sea coast just a little bit north of Israel. And by ship, remember the Phoenicians, according to Ezekiel's book, were famous shipping people, famous maritime people. Whenever they built the temple, then we have Phoenicians that come down and bring them lumber. Whenever the kings of Israel want to build a navy, way down in Ezion Deeper, which is right here, which is the Gulf of Aqaba in modern Israel today, the only port that Israel has to her south here, then, of course, they call on the Phoenicians. They're great shipbuilders, they're great mariners, they're experts in woodwork like that, and they're experts in sailing. Therefore, it's really not any surprise to know that the Carthaginians are Phoenicians by descent, even though we're talking about maybe 1,000 miles from their origin and from their base, they're Phoenicians by descent. This is all North Africa. You have Libya and Egypt and Morocco and stuff across here right now. Spain, Gaul, which is France, Italy, Yugoslavia, Greece, so forth over here. But here's the city and here's the little region to be familiar with now. You see, we had pointed out this before, and I think I've said on an earlier map where it cut it off like that, and we were looking at this, and I said right around the corner there'll kind of be another hump, a lot larger one, and on the tip of that will be where Carthage is found. Notice Carthage here, Rome here, not a very great distance between one another at all. This is Carthage, C-A-R-T-H-A-G. Carthage is the next great power, really the great power with whom Rome has to contend. Now, I guess the next important thing to mention is the topography of the Mediterranean world to show you why Rome controlled the part of the world that she did. Without putting up another map, you're familiar with Mesopotamia over here, are you not? You know what that looks like, the Fertile Crescent that loops up and down through Palestine like this, and all the way down, really, you could take it into the Nile Delta of Egypt. For the most part, the whole Mediterranean is kind of surrounded by mountains. And that is why this line here represents the extent of the Roman Empire. Like 1st century A.D. We're talking about like 1st century A.D. We have a series of mountains, particularly along here. Of course, all of these countries, they're just controlled by mountains. Here's the Cilician Mountains, and you might even, well, you don't have it on this map, but you've got the Cilician Gates right by Tarsus that I mentioned before. With few exceptions, those being over here in Egypt, where you can have mountains because you have a delta of a river here, and the Levant over here, the Mediterranean world, the lands that border on all sides of the Mediterranean Sea, only have so many miles inland of flat territory until it goes up into mountains. And so basically what Rome does is just conquer the area into the mountains without going over them, and then where are you going to put a period then? You go all the way down to South Africa because we're in North Africa here. So that is why you kind of see a loop like this. She just controls these nations that somehow border, with a few exceptions like Great Britain, that border on the Mediterranean Sea. Now she's in an ideal place, as is Carthage. Look where Carthage sticks out here. Carthage is a great maritime naval power, obviously because she has descended from the Phoenicians, she would have to be. And Rome by this time is creeping up on Carthage to rival her as a naval maritime power. They would have to be, if you're going to control such an extent, where the most important geographical feature in that extent or in your territory is this, what Rome wants to make a lake in her backyard, the Mediterranean Sea. You certainly really couldn't control all of this by land forces, because notice, if you're right here in Rome, we're talking about traveling all the way around here to Carthage, and it's just not going to work that way. Although the Carthaginians do go this way in one attempt towards Rome, basically we're going to talk about the naval powers as we have them here. Now I said that a notable exception to this theory of mountains rising, and that's why Rome doesn't go that far. A lot of this territory is just given over to her. We'll discuss that more in a moment, and some of that we've already said earlier. A notable exception to this theory of the mountains rising would be Egypt, which we're not studying Egyptian history, so we're not concerned about that, and what's known as the Levant. That's just kind of a short name to cover all of what we call today the Middle East, although it really doesn't cover that much. Basically, Lebanon, Syria, and Israel is known as the Levant, L-E-V-A-N-T. So if you've never heard that term before, I've used it some before. If you've never heard it, maybe you need to put it into your memory so I can use it from now on. The Levant, L-E-V-A-N-T, speaks of Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. Or you could just describe it that the countries that border on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. And those really are the countries that border right here. Only these countries that border on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean are referred to as the Levant. That's an exception to this mountain theory because you don't have a lot of mountains right there in Israel. Israel is not a mountainous, not when we think of Alps, Israel is not a mountainous country. And so, as the historians are prone to say, Rome at this time is just perched to turn the Mediterranean Sea into her backyard lake. And to do that, she's going to have to defeat Carthage. Let's say a few things about Carthage, and then we'll get into the Punic Wars. Well, I've already mentioned that it was a colony of Phoenicia. But whenever Alexander the Great took Phoenicia, that's earlier in this study, that's on an earlier tape. Whenever Alexander the Great took Phoenicia, which was a famous battle there of Tyre and Sidon, of course he's not coming all the way over here to take Carthage because he's heading eastwardly, not westwardly. And so Carthage is pretty much cut off. By the way, those that survive Alexander the Great's assault against the Phoenicians, they get in boats and come to Carthage. And we're talking about, the end of the 4th century BC, the 330s, 320s BC. So that only fortifies and repopulates the population of Carthage, which is going to be important because it fortifies them against their battles with Rome, for their battles against Rome, which will come in the near future. So we've got a big interplay here between Carthage and Phoenicia and what Alexander the Great did to Phoenicia and how it just leaves Carthage basically out on her own. Now, Carthage, we end up with what we call 3 Punic Wars, P-U-N-I-C. It's just an adjective that describes something to do with the ancient Carthaginians. That's all the word Punic means. It doesn't mean puny. It's just an adjective, a peculiar adjective, that describes anything, something to do with the ancient Carthaginians. 3 great contests are fought, and the booty would of course be control of the Mediterranean world. The winner would get control of the Mediterranean world. So Punic War number 1 was fought from 264 to 241. We're not talking about a battle that was done on April the 15th or something. We're talking about years of struggle. The First Punic War ran from 264 to 241. We'll give you the dates and we'll briefly describe what happens in each of the Punic Wars. 3 Punic Wars, 3 no less and no more. 264 to 241. Basically, I will describe the outcome, not all of the skirmishes and who has done what over such a long period of time. Prior to this time, the Carthaginians have controlled Sicily because the Phoenicians are a more ancient empire than are the Romans, which makes the Carthaginians more ancient of an empire than the Romans, which only means that probably these territories, if they belong to one or the other, the Carthaginians or the Romans, it would be to the former, not the latter. So the Carthaginians have been in control of Sicily, they've been in control of Sardinia, they've been in control of Corsica. Corsica and Sardinia are not important in New Testament study. Sicily is because Paul travels through Sicily. Right by Sicily, right through this, and crosses right over there on his way to Rome. We have our little island of Malta or Melita right down here, and then he goes to Sicily from there. And then we get things like Syracuse, New York, from Syracuse, Sicily. Now, Sicily at this time, can you see that there's a separation? Maybe you can if you're way back, but between the toe on the boot and Sicily. Sicily at that time, not true today, but at that time, the territory, the northeastern tip of Sicily and the toe of the boot of Italy were within shouting distance. You could stand on one land and you could shout over to the other. Of course, it's not like that anymore just because of the passage of time and erosion and the storms and the weather and the sea and so forth. But that time, Sicily is almost connected to the toe on the Italian boot, which makes Rome want to control it, and almost as part of the peninsula of Italy itself. Moreover, Corsica and Sardinia are actually closer to Rome than is Sicily, which makes Rome want to control Corsica and Sardinia as well. So the general outcome, just reducing everything in a simplified fashion, the general outcome of the First Punic War was that Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica are all ceded over by the Carthaginians to the Romans. In other words, Rome is victor. Rome is victor in the first of the Punic Wars, and the booty of her victory, the prize, the loot, is Sicily, the provinces of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. And Sicily actually is made the first, if I remember correctly, the first of Roman provinces. We'll study the provincial system of Rome because that your knowledge of that helps you interpret, for the better or for the worse, the study of the New Testament. Are we talking about senatorial provinces or are we talking about imperial provinces? If I remember correctly, Sicily was a senatorial province at that time. But by the time of Augustus Caesar, Octavian, the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, whenever he becomes sole leader in 30 B.C. and takes the title Augustus Caesar in 27 B.C., then the provinces that come into the Roman treasury from that time forth are all made into imperial provinces and not senatorial. That's only because Rome as a republic is fading off the scene, and the Senate does not have nearly the control that it had at one time because of the new Roman emperors. Okay, so the end of the First War, 241 B.C., Rome takes Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and that kind of paves the way for the future battles that are to come. Any questions up till now? I know I'm rattling a lot off, but I'm trying to kind of give you the thrust of this, because I don't want you to get lost, or then you get me lost, and well, that was about, 74 lines back is where it was. Punic War number 2, 218 to 201 B.C. See, in 265, she gains control of the Italian peninsula, and then the First Punic War begins in 264. And all of this is like, 70 years after Alexander's conquest, Alexander the Great's conquest of Phoenicia, which brought the Phoenicians over to the city of Carthage and turned them into Carthaginians, but they were Phoenicians wherever they were anyway. Now, the Second Punic War is the most interesting of the two because it concerns the interesting man that we've all heard of known as Hannibal. Now, on ITP tape number 28, you might want to mark that down and refer to your notes there. Hannibal, after his defeat, Hannibal, actually flees to the court of Antiochus the Great, the Seleucid king. And we discussed a little bit of that then, and I told you then, don't worry, because we'd look at it in the future. Now I'm telling you, don't worry, we've already looked at it in the past. So if you put all that together, I'm sure you'll find whatever answer it is for which you're looking. Hannibal, as a young boy growing up in Carthage, Hannibal made an oath and a vow that when he became a man, he would wipe Rome off the face of the map. And he came very close. So it wasn't as though we have a reckless man on our hands here. Hannibal had dreamed of this and promised and swore that he would do it from a little boy of 9 years old, growing up in Carthage. Now, if Hannibal would have been successful, he would have forever changed the course of history as we now know it. There's no doubt about that. Whether America would have been discovered yet or would be here, who knows? But if the Carthaginians would have become the Mediterranean power, which would have made them the world power, and not the Romans, no one knows exactly what would have happened, except to say the face of history would have been changed as we now know it and understand it. Now, what Hannibal does, rather than go through this business of naval battles, because obviously, since we've talked about 3 islands here, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, we've talked about naval battles then. Rather than get involved in that again, what Hannibal does is he goes over here to the Straits of Gibraltar, and he crosses over into Spain, and about, almost 1,000 years after this time, the famous Battle of Tours is going to be fought, where Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, stops the invading Mohammedans they've conquered all of North Africa. But we'll study that in church history. That's up in the beginning of the 8th century, around 732, the beginning of the 8th century AD. We're going to have another famous battle over here, the famous Battle of Tours. But anyway, that's 1,000 years in advance. He crosses over into Spain. He travels up into modern-day France, what was called Gaul, and I've spoken of Caesar's Gallic campaigns and his Gallic wars. This is Gaul right here, which today, of course, is France or France. And, of course, the only way you can get into Italy from the north, you've got a problem, is you have to cross the Alps. 20,000 feet high. Notice that it's just surrounded by the Alps here. And so does he give up? No, he crosses the Alps in wintertime with a train of elephants. The elephants are his idea. They've been used earlier in history. We've studied them in the Apocrypha, as a matter of fact. He brings with him a train of elephants. Again, pardon me for simplifying it to stereotyped understanding of Roman history, but I think that will satisfy all of us, because we're not studying Rome to study Rome, we're studying Rome to study the New Testament and Israel. But he brings a train of elephants across the Alps, one of the most fantastic military maneuvers ever performed, and defeats the Romans sent against him in northern Italy. Whenever Hannibal crosses the Alps, and all of these tribes, they're all controlled by city-states. We've discussed that when we discussed the Greek language earlier, because Greece is such a mountainous country. It was controlled by city-states. Italy is mountainous as well, and it was controlled by city-states as well. Whenever Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, crosses over the Alps, then many, not all, but many, especially up in the northern and the central region, many of the city-states or the tribes in Italy revolt against Rome and go over to the side of the Carthaginians. So in other words, not only does Rome have to send out her armies and her armed forces up to the northwestern corner to defeat Hannibal, and Rome fails miserably when she sends her armed forces to try to defeat him, she's also got to keep in mind all of these other city-states around Rome who are thinking of what? Well, for years now, Rome has controlled the whole Italian peninsula. Who likes to be controlled by someone else? Isn't this a primary time, a prime opportunity now for all the city-states to revolt and try to get their independence back, since it looks like the Carthaginians are going to defeat the Romans? So Rome has a major problem on her hands here. How to defeat Hannibal who seems to be unstoppable at this point, and how to subdue the revolt and the simmering fires of all of these city-states around. So as I said, she sends up an army to begin with. The army's defeated. Another army is sent, another army is defeated. And Hannibal is on the march to the capital of Rome, the city of Rome itself. According to the ancient accounts, a little romantic, but maybe a little spiced up, but it sounds good anyway. The Romans finally stopped Hannibal by sending in a herd of swine in the midst of the elephants, and elephants are terrified over hogs. You've heard an elephant squealing over a mouse? Well, they're supposed to be terrified of hogs as well. And you can get them to stampede and turn the other way by sending a herd of hogs or swine in their midst. We saw that in the Apocrypha, if you remember. They roused the elephants with the mulberry juice, got them snorting and ready to go, and then someone sent some pigs in. So Rome sent some pigs in. It quenches the Carthaginian march on Rome because it scatters the elephants. Hannibal ends up fleeing to the Seleucid court way over here in Antioch of Antiochus the Great, way back earlier in Daniel 11, where basically he's going to come to an end. He's, of course, advising, he's advising Antiochus the Great, let's start up against Rome, but he hasn't been so successful before, so I don't know that he's really one to take advice from. Then secondly, Rome quenches, systematically she has to quench the rebellion of the various Italian city-states, which had also risen up with Carthage against Rome. That stops Hannibal, that stops the elephants, that stops the immediate threat to the Roman Empire, that stops the revolt, systematically quenched the fires stirring up and brewing among the various Italian city-states. What about Carthage itself? Well, Rome then, with her naval forces, invades. We're still in the Second Punic War, invades the city of Carthage itself. Defeats the Carthaginians in 201 BC, and brings an end to the Second Punic War. For her troubles in this war, she gains Spain and she gains part of France, which had been Carthaginian prior to this. Okay, the Third Punic War was fought a half a century later, from 149 to 146. From 149 to 146. Here, Carthage is invaded, again, attacked. Famous scene from ancient history. The buildings of the city are leveled, and the city is sown with salt. There's a biblical reference to a city that happened to. I'm trying to find it. It's in the book of Judges. Oh, Judges chapter 9. See, that's one reason you can't change your Bible, or you can't ad-lib and find a verse in, because it'll be on the wrong blasted page whenever you look for it. Judges 9 and verse 45. To sow a city with salt, of course, symbolically means the city will never rise again, and possibly that's what you're going to end up with, because no vegetation is going to grow. You bring a very symbolic and a very picturesque end to that city. Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He took the city, slew the people that were therein, beat down the city, that is the structure of the city, and sowed it with salt. Judges 9:45. Only biblical account that I know of the city being sown with salt. But the most famous city ever sown with salt was the city of ancient Carthage. So in 146, Carthage as a power, really as a city, comes to an infamous end. That makes Rome master of the Mediterranean Sea. That puts Rome in the position then to be knocking on the door to Palestine, to the Levant, to all these territories eastwardly. Notice everything she's gained has been to the west. Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Spain, Gaul, or France. All that she's gained has been to the west. Now that was obviously the most important event as far as the future history of Rome was concerned, was the final defeat of Carthage in the final Punic War. She makes the Mediterranean Sea, the lake in her backyard. Now she controls much to the south, much to the west, much to the north. What about to the east? Well, in conclusion tonight, let's study a little bit about the east, because that will bring us over here to the Levant then, and we will be through. She controls much to the north, to the south, to the west. What about to the east? Well, the Macedonians, here's Macedonia right here, with its chief city of Philippi and Thessalonica. The Macedonians had been allies of the Carthaginians in the Punic Wars, in the last Punic War. The Macedonians had been allies of the Carthaginians. And so, in 146, with the conclusion to the last Punic War, Rome is going to teach not only Carthage a lesson that she will never forget and from which she will never rise again, but she's going to teach her allies the same lesson as well. And so, it's a famous other date in history, not as famous as maybe 753, but important when you want to study the archaeology and the history of the city of Corinth. Rome in 146 demolishes the city of Corinth, which is a tragedy from the point of view of archaeology. And I've been to Corinth and seen some of the destruction that the Romans did in 146 BC. They did that as an example to all the Greeks. That was an easy city to get to. Otherwise, you've got to go all the way around and come up here to Macedonia. 146, Rome destroyed Carthage as an example to all Greeks and annexed through Corinth. And of course, Athens is just across the isthmus here, annexed the entire nation of Greece. So Greece becomes a Roman province now. Now remember, Greek had been the great world empire on the scene just prior to Rome. So now Greece becomes nothing but a part of Roman culture. She's assimilated into that, although Rome also assimilates much of the ideals of the Greeks. Then, according to your chart, we've already mentioned this before. We're just going chronologically. If you look on your chart, 133 BC, now you see how all this fits together chronologically. Attalus, the king of Pergamon, at his death, wills his kingdom, Asia Minor, over to the Romans. That's on your chart, the very bottom, the far left-hand side. One of the vertical notes there. Rome begins Eastern Empire. Attalus, king of Pergamon, bequeaths kingdom to Rome. Okay, so in the 200s and 100s BC up to 146, Rome is gaining all of this. In 146, she comes over and sacks Corinth, and through Corinth gains Greece, 146 BC. 133, see, it's just a progression. I want you to notice the steps she's taking toward the east to get over here to Palestine. I mean, she's not thinking in her mind, let's go conquer Palestine, but that is the territory to which she is going. 133, here's Pergamum, right where the pointer is. So she gains Asia Minor, and then over the process of the next few years, she gains all of this province of Asia here, and that brings her right down here in 64 BC, which your chart has for you, knocking on the door of Syria. As she goes through Syria, the next year, 63 BC, Pompey conquers Palestine.